doors shut. All right, so I think we could continue with the next presentation here. Before I do that, I think I just wanted to, give you a little snippet of my life. As a GM, I have three jobs. The one I really love, which is being in the field with the customers, whether it's closing a deal or getting beat up on things we didn't do right. I still enjoy both of those. Second job is managing the investors. I don't know if they're in the room, by the way. I did invite them at the very last minute. We're owned by a private equity firm out of San Francisco. Great relationship with them, but my joke there is with them that when the revenues are good, they're wondering why the margins are not high enough. When the margins are good, they're like, why are you not investing enough? You can never win. But it's a job you have to do. But the third part is dealing with our team and actually creating the things that we get out to you guys. And one of the advantages is that I can delegate my speaking slot to other folks. So which is what we have done here. And you'll have a slightly new format than we have tried before. You're going to see a few folks from our team, led by Michelle Nerlinger, who's our Director of Marketing. And then she's going to introduce some of the other speakers along the way. So slightly different format. Having said that, I think I just want to remind you what I said at the beginning of the session. I think the intent of this session is to give you a little bit of framework for how you should really think about implementing overall licensing system, all the different elements that you have to think through. And I was telling somebody in the hallway that sometimes you get an RFP and you get 8 points, and your tendency to respond to those 8 points. But I think sometimes it's better to step back and look at what it takes overall to create a licensing system. And that's what I hope this gives you a framework for. With that, I'm going to introduce Michelle.
Thanks, Prakash. I guess it's my turn to figure out the laptop. All right, I think we're all set. Switch. Okay, great. So, like Prakash said, I head up marketing for SafeNet. So what we're going to do today is talk about the concept of software monetization. Now, that really sounds like something somebody in marketing made up, but it really does have a definition, I promise. And I'm sure to everyone in the room, it means something slightly different. So let's talk about what it means to SafeNet, and then let's talk about how we're going to use it to kind of shape the rest of this afternoon's agenda. So SafeNet's been around for 25 years and in the software licensing business. And when we first started out, licensing was all about two things: prevention and protection. Prevention of unauthorized use and distribution, and protection of your IP. Protection of your IP from tampering, reverse engineering, or theft. What it wasn't about was flexibility. It certainly wasn't about customer experience, understanding how your customers use your application, how they're using it, and designing business models that support that usage. So somewhere along the way, that power shifted. It shifted from the ISV to the end user. The decision of how, when, and at what cost your software could be consumed became one that the end user was influencing. So what does that mean for everyone in this room? You should change your expectation of us, of a company like SafeNet, what we should be providing you. You shouldn't be asking us for a protection and a prevention solution. You should be asking us for a software monetization solution. So back to the original question, what is software monetization? Well, generically, monetization can be viewed as any collection of techniques somebody can use to increase the profitability of their intellectual property. In this case, software. So for a software vendor, these techniques could range from sophisticated anti-piracy to IP protection techniques to flexible and creative pricing and packaging techniques. There's no individual technique that is a silver bullet, and a combination of all these techniques is what you need to be more successful. So no matter how you deliver your software, what it is you've developed, there's 4 things that you have to remember. There's 4 aspects that you'll need to take into consideration that the success of your software hinges upon. Your ability to package, control, track, and manage your applications. So what we're going to do here is try a slightly different format and walk through each of these 4 categories. But to do that, I'm going to ask for help from some of my colleagues who spend actually more time probably in the field with our customers, understanding their use cases and what they need to do to provide for their end users than they probably do at home with their families. So let me go ahead. I'm going to introduce them. The first one's Dave DeMillo. Dave, I think a lot of you know, come on up. A lot of you know Dave. Dave is our principal consultant here at SafeNet. He spends his nights and weekends helping you guys solve all of your licensing challenges. Then we have Durem Ramatala. Durem serves on our product management team. DRIM is responsible for all of our enforcement-related products, so really that control aspect. We have Jam Khan, who's the Senior Director of Client Services. So anybody in the room who knows Jam knows him pretty much through his work with our PSG group. And then finally, we have Julie Armstrong, who's also a part of our product management group. And Julie heads up product management for the management portion of our portfolio. So I'm going to make them sit here during our transitions. I don't think you need this. You got that? Oh. That's all right. So we're going to talk about the first one, packaging. Right? So as you're going to hear later today from Rob of OpsView, flexible packaging is so important for a software vendor to succeed in today's market. One size is never going to fit all. I think Amy already made the joke. To be successful with pricing and packaging, you really need to understand who your customers are, what they're using, what they perceive to be the derived value of your software, not what you think the value is, and how they prefer to consume your software. Sounds complex? Let's simplify it. Going into any engagement, there's really 3 things that you or your sales organization needs to consider when you're building a pricing or packaging strategy for every customer. What aspects of your solution is it that the customer wants to consume? Not the long list of features that you've developed and think they should want, but what do they actually come to you for in the first place? What are the things they need? And it might only be a handful of that long list of features that you thought was valuable in the first place. Secondly, how do they want to consume it? Right? I think all the presenters so far today touched on this. Not everybody wants to pay for everything all up front. Not every business can support that. Again, if you're a smaller startup company, you may not have the money to throw at it all at once. You might just want to invest monthly payments, weekly payments per user. You need to be able to provide that level of flexibility. And then finally, the price. The price is that combination of these 2 things we've just discussed. Once you understand how the customer is going to be using your application and how they want to consume it, you can figure out a fair price that both you and the customer agree on. So what's needed for this? Flexible packaging. So let's talk about an example really quick. So let's say you believe what I say. You say, okay, 3 points. I can remember that. That's easy. So you go back, you talk to your sales, and they go out and they go out to the sales team and they start to try to apply this methodology. And your first sales rep's really excited. He comes back and he says, all right, great. I've got an opportunity, and here's what they want. They want 3 features. They want to pay per user per month, and then we have both agreed that $33 a month is going to be the perfect price point. We all think it's fair. Great, let me do it. And you think, crap. You've never licensed at the feature level. Right? Up until now, you've only ever offered all 5 of your features in one package at a $300,000 3-year subscription with unlimited user access. So you have physically what they want. You have what they need, but they might walk away from it because you can't offer it to them in the way that they need it packaged. So how do you achieve this? Flexible packaging. And as Dave's going to walk through in a moment, flexible packaging really requires 3 things: product versatility, licensing flexibility, and operational agility. So my last slide before I hand it off to Dave is really just what does that look like for you? It's easy to say those things, but what does that really mean? So that means the ability to break out the individual features of your product from a core product and associate an individual value with those. Take those features and bundle them into different packages, and then offer those packages at varying price points, but then also be able, at the full product level, as well as down to the feature level, associate a variety of licensing models. Then, finally, and almost most important of all, is the agility, the ability to change those things on the fly, anytime, whenever you need to. And this really gives you the ability to offer the right offering for the right customer every time. So I'm going to hand it over to Dave. I'm going to hand it over to Dave, who's going to talk about packaging in action.
Thanks, Michelle. Yep, good. Thanks. And thanks for everyone for coming. Shameless introduction. I head up consulting for SafeNet. I work with our customers to put together their licensing plans and licensing strategies. I've worked with OpsView. You'll hear from Rob later on. I've worked with Torsten. You'll hear from Varian Medical Systems later on. And in that role, again, we put together their short-term and long-term licensing strategies. But Prior to SafeNet, I spent a lot of time working for IBM and other companies as a licensing product manager. So it's great in this job where sometimes I can take off my SafeNet hat and really speak from the ISV perspective. Michelle asked me to talk a little bit about packaging. And prior to SafeNet, as I mentioned, I worked for Rational Software right down the street here in Cupertino, and where I worked, again, as a licensing product manager. And I was also sentenced to work on the pricing and new product introduction team as well, and co-chair that committee. And what we built was this really cool van that had a unicorn on the side of it. And it's a California company that we did stuff like that. Anyway, so I really thought Rational was a great example because from a business perspective, it was a company that leveraged the license enforcement really on the business side of the house. So it wasn't just about keeping customers compliant. It was, how can we leverage our enforcement to make good business decisions? So again, I thought Rational was a good example. So we had 30 plus software products, as we heard from Alan earlier for the customer he was working with. We sold each product a la carte. Sure, makes sense. And we had license enforcement that kept our customers compliant. Sure, made sense. But again, from the packaging perspective and from the business perspective, the questions were, how can we use this to our advantage, right? How can we bundle up like things to, in creative ways to create new offerings targeted at certain roles, right, engineering tool roles, as well as new markets without impacting engineering, right, without having to go back and building specific, things into our product to support those licensing models. And what we realized is that we could leverage our license enforcement to do just that, right? And by creating those new types of solutions, we sort of shifted our company from just selling products a la carte to selling specific solutions targeted at solving specific problems. We went too far, and I'll talk about that too. But let's take a look at what this looks like. So from the packaging perspective, right, with the license enforcement at the product level, the ability to turn a product on and off at the customer site, right, we viewed these as Legos, right? They were individual building blocks from a packaging perspective that we could stick together and create new targeted solutions, right? And the great part was that these offerings were completely decoupled from engineering. And what I mean by that is what we built, right, what we engineered, ClearCase, ClearQuest, Rose, some other products, right? What engineering built and what we sold and how we sold it were completely two different things, right? So we had a change management solution targeted at release engineering, right? The ClearCase guys had no idea what a change management solution was, and they didn't care, and we didn't want them to care. We wanted them to build ClearCase, but from a packaging perspective, outward facing to our customers, we wanted to sell a solution, okay? We had another suite called the Team Unifying Platform with different sets of Legos, and we threw the kitchen sink in to Suite Enterprise in the Uber suite. Okay? Now, with each of these offerings, we sold them concurrent user, i.e. floating, standalone, perpetual, term, and slice and dice that way to, in ways that made sense. But again, from the engineering perspective, there's no impact. From the packaging perspective, it allowed us to mix and match pretty easily, create new offerings strictly on the business side of the house. Okay? Extremely flexible business model, but with any weapon of mass destruction, right, you can take things too far. And we sort of did that. Now, as a consultant, I would be remiss if I didn't offer a chart that kind of goes astray here, but some best practices around packaging, particularly around suites and bundling up products. So the first thing I would say is fight the urge, right, to go uber crazy with packaging, right? Because adding a product to a suite is really easy to say this, putting together your Legos is really easy. Taking a product out of the suite over time is really challenging. Your customers will expect that product to be in the suite. There are some issues around, versioning, releasing those individual point products, if you will, on different staggering schedules and so forth. But the other thing that we found, and here's something I want to get across too with packaging up products, is that most of our customers really were only interested in 2 to 3 products in the suite, right? They wanted ClearCase, they wanted ClearQuest, and maybe something else. But it was cheaper just to buy our kitchen sink Uber suite, right? And the result of that at the time was really cool because we said, oh, customer just got all the software, great. Low price point. But over time we realized, hey, we actually over-entitled the customer, right? The customer had all kinds of software on the shelf that they didn't really use. But what it did is as we evolved those products, it kind of limited our upsell and our cross-sell capabilities because the customer already had that stuff that we could have otherwise sold them later on. Okay, so that was an opportunity we kind of missed. So my lesson here around the suites is create small, targeted packages and bundle up like things that will have a similar shelf life, if you will, similar release schedule, close cousins as far as versioning, et cetera. Okay, and don't go uber crazy because it can come back to bite you. All right, getting back on topic, I thought the rational example was good to see how, to show how a company can leverage enforcement at the product level. So again, just turning off a product. We're working with GE. They've been a customer of ours for a long time. And they implemented feature-based licensing. So that's the ability to turn a module within the product on and off depending on what they bought. So I thought this was a good example because GE had static part numbers associated with static option sets. For example, product number 1 or part number 1 would be for the product with, say, 6 modules enabled, and they would have a separate part number for the same product with only 3 modules enabled. Well, the problem over time was that they had an exploded price list, right? Because you needed a separate part number for every module combination. It was kind of heavyweight on the sales guys and too many choices for customers, as we saw earlier today. Now, what GE was doing was wanted to overhaul their business model and really move the packaging from static part numbers into being much more of a fluid and dynamic model so that they would have, say, 1 part number per product, and then the customer can configure those modules at order time. So they really moved, again, the modular piece of their packaging from individual part numbers to something that's more dynamic at order time. The customer would select the part number, select the modules they want, and then, of course, the license key that we delivered would turn on those modules individually. So it was a simple concept, relatively simple implementation. Right? It's not rocket science. The devil's in the details. However, the point is that they couldn't have transformed their business from being a very rigid, static company to having more dynamic offerings without having that infrastructure in place, right? Without being able to have control over those features and so forth. So it was really that underpinning that gave them that type of flexibility. Okay. And I think, yeah, that's it. So thanks for your time. I'll be here for the next couple days. Try the veal.
So next we're going to move on to the next aspect of monetization, which is control, right? So control, I think, is probably the aspect most everyone in this room is most familiar with, right? So when we're talking about control, all of the creative pricing and packaging in the world, everything Dave just talked about, is no good if you don't have any ability to control it, right? If you can't ensure the payments for products and services rendered, and if you can't protect your intellectual property from theft or manipulation once it's in the field. So just quickly covering that, again, it's about revenue protection and protection of your intellectual property. So keeping it simple on the first one, revenue protection is really about who's authorized to access your application at any given time and to what extent. right? So I think this is a concept we're all familiar with, so not to go too in-depth with it, but I do think an important point to make here is that the more complicated your license models become, the more critical control is. So if we use a simple example to articulate that, let's think about trials. If trials happen to be one of the tactics your marketing team, favors for getting late-stage prospects on board, let's say it's 30 days. And your marketing team's done a great job. They have hundreds of trial users coming in on a monthly basis, but you don't have the effective control mechanism in place to stop the access to the software when that 30 days expires. You've just given away your software away to free for hundreds of people. The same logic applies to things like subscriptions and user-based access. So if I'm subscribed to access something for a year, and at the end of that year, if you don't cut my subscription off, I can keep using. And I think, they didn't track it, I'm not going to stop using it. Lost revenue opportunity there. And for the feature-based licensing, we talked about how this is getting so popular. People only want to use what they're accessing. If they only want to use, the 3 basic features in the basic version of your software, but you've packaged it right, and you said, okay, I only have one software application, and I'm going to give everybody the same application, but manage at the feature level. If you don't have a way to keep them from accessing the premium features, they're going to be able to access them at the lower price point than the customers who paid for the premium, and it's a lost revenue opportunity for you. So when we think about control or revenue protection, we also start to think a little bit about theft, right? Maybe not so much as I'm going to go to it on the IP protection side, but we think about protecting our applications from redistribution in the field. We think about, okay, if somebody gets my software, are they going to give it to their friends? Are they going to resell it? And that's one aspect of it. Then my application, exactly as it exists today, being redistributed. That will hurt our revenue. But also, there's 2 additional reasons that people sometimes overlook how it relates to their revenue. And those are reverse engineering and tampering. So reverse engineering also runs the risk of redistribution of your software. But the difference here is that the person who's stolen your software has been able to understand how it works. They know how to rebuild your software, and then they can redistribute it either under a fake company name that can compete against your real application, or sometimes even worse, they'll redistribute it under your name with cheaper components, or with, if it's shipped in a hardware, maybe the cheapest hardware they can find, they'll throw your pirated software in there. And the end user, the worst part is they don't understand that what they're getting is a knockoff. They may think they've bought it from you legitimately. And so not only is that going to hurt your revenue, but that's also going to hurt the reputation of both your product and your brand. And that'll be future customers you never see. And then finally is tampering. And this is sometimes the thing I think people think of least. And Jerem's got a great example of how this really impacted a huge company that he's going to walk through in just a second. Tampering is when somebody goes in and can access the software in your application and change the way it functions, whether it's an application or it's an application running a piece of equipment. And by doing that, you designed your software to work the way it does for a reason. So this can be done maliciously or with good intent. It doesn't matter. If somebody's changed the way your software functions, it can have negative implications. It can put you out of compliance with rules and regulations that you needed to be in compliance with in the first place. It can change the output of what your application or product was meant to do. Just bad all around. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Jerem, who's going to walk you through a really interesting example.
Thanks, Michelle. So when Michelle first asked me to talk about control, my first reaction was admittedly one of disappointment. Now, considering that I'm responsible for license enforcement, that was also probably a career-limiting admission to just make. But the reason why I kind of felt a bit of disappointment, because as Michelle said, it is the most talked about subject. When you talk about control, the first things you think about are piracy protection, IP protection. They're all topics that pretty much everybody in this room are very familiar with. We all know them very, very well. It's all about securing software, about stopping the bad guys from stealing your stuff, ultimately. And then when Michelle talked about the tampering control, this is where there was a very interesting angle that we could use. And this is where Tetra Pak came to mind. So I guess most of you, if not all of you, have heard of Tetra Pak. They're the producers of packaging for milk, for foods, and so on and so forth. That's what they're known for. The Tetra Pak business is actually the end-to-end solution. At a factory line, you'll get a brown slurry at one end in a giant vat, and at the other end you'll get little cartons of, I don't know, carrot and potato soup or something like that. And Tetra Pak is responsible for all of the components between those two endpoints. So the manufacturing, the cleaning, the sterilization, all of the different stages of that food preparation that take place before you get to the final box of content. Because of the nature of their business, they are very, very strictly governed by food hygiene standards all over the world. Pretty much every country has some very strict guidelines around hygiene and around food standards. They're probably the most tightly controlled in the world. So they are completely governed by these standards and by this legislation. And another point about Tetra Pak is that they have customers all over the world. They have customers in typically developing countries where production lines are cheaper to run, labor forces are cheaper. Malaysia, Mexico, wherever these, typically these, where the labor forces cost less, the production lines are typically going to be located there. And also, they just so happen to be in countries where there's slightly less, there's a more relaxed view about maintaining certain standards, about maintaining certain controls. So with those points, you kind of just think, okay, that sounds pretty standard. That's a pretty standard model and a pretty standard scenario around why somebody wants to have control. Where Tetra Pak comes in, different angle, they didn't really have a piracy problem. They were not concerned at all with piracy. It was way down the bottom of their list as far as concerns were concerned. So we'll talk a little bit about the problem that they actually had. So they've got thousands of engineers all over the world. These engineers are typically highly trained, highly skilled people that are responsible for changing parameters on these enormous production lines, the size of this room, and they'll have access to a controller at one end of the room that'll change a certain parameter. It could be a temperature control. It could be the amount of time that something gets washed for, whatever it is. Very, very highly skilled. You can't just walk into one of these production lines and know how to use it and how to operate these things after just a half a day's training or so on and so forth. The problem is that they had unauthorized engineers that weren't trained into changing a certain parameter that would maybe reduce the temperature of the washing equipment or reduce the sterilization temperature by maybe half a degree. Now, over the course of a year, that would save hundreds of thousands of dollars on that production line. The end result is you get a carton of milk that maybe has slightly more bacteria in it than it should do, that maybe spoils a day earlier than it should do, and so on and so forth. The other problem is that customers Tetra Pak obviously produce the materials, the boxes, the paper, to package these foods up. And the standards that go into the manufacturing of this paper is also extremely high. It's got to be airtight, it's got to be sterile, and so on and so forth. It's also expensive, at least compared to some third-party alternatives. You can buy imitation Tetra Pak material. It's very, very easy to get hold of. That's not built to the same standards, that's not built to the same hygiene standards, and so on and so forth. People were taking these rolls of material, sticking into their production lines because it was saving money. The third area is that the control software itself, the software that's responsible for managing the production and the filling and the cleaning and so on and so forth, was being deployed onto cheaper. I always blame, I'm always bringing up China, and the poor guys, they definitely get a lot of this blame. But let's just say, Chinese-built equipment that does exactly the same job as the Tetra Pak equipment, but maybe there's certain standards that they've missed out. Maybe there's certain shortcuts that are being made. But the software, the control software, is being used on this third-party, cheaper equipment to produce this content, to produce the milk, to produce the food, and so on and so forth. But again, it's just producing a reduced quality product at the end of the day. Now, so this reduced output quality, this is translated pretty much straightforward into Tetra Pak's deficiencies. If the milk is spoiling after one day, if the food is not sealed properly, and so on and so forth, this translates into failures in Tetra Pak, in Tetra Pak's product, be it from the packaging equipment to the production, to the sealing, to whatever it is. It all comes back into being Tetra Pak's problem. although that, as far as they're concerned, they were totally not involved in creating that problem. This weakens a brand. They've got a 50-year brand of quality, of maintaining hygiene standards and so on and so forth. And this weakens that brand. That was ultimately one of the biggest problems that they came to us with, is like we're losing our strong packaging food protection brand. And then this was another major point, is that they could not adhere to certain regulations, and most specifically the FDA here in the US. The FDA were basically saying to Tetra Pak, unless you can give us sufficient assurances that the production lines cannot be tampered with in a certain way, that the temperatures can't be adjusted, that you can't use cheaper paper, and so on and so forth, unless you can provide us with sufficient assurance that all of these loopholes can't be broken, then we can't approve your products for being sold into the US. So that was a huge market that they were being blocked from accessing into. So, the way it was solved. A couple of different ways it was solved. The first thing is that licensing came into play as far as the engineers were concerned. The engineers had to be in possession of a specific license. The engineers had a configuration tool that was plugged into the system. That tool would be responsible for changing certain parameters and so on and so forth. They needed a license. You had to be an approved engineer to have a license to change temperature. You had to be an approved engineer to have to change the sealing pressure or whatever the parameter was. You had to be approved and authorized by Tetra Pak before you could do that. And the way that Tetra Pak controlled that was making sure that there was licenses delivered to the relevant engineers to use in their relevant tools. If you didn't have a license to change the temperature, then you couldn't do it. It's as simple as that. The other thing is these licenses were locked down to hardware. They were locked down to hardware fingerprints. They were locked down to the stations that were responsible for configuring configuring the controller software. So that basically meant that if I have a heat control license, I can't send that heat control license over to a different site in Guatemala or wherever where they can install that, and then that site automatically then has the rights to control temperature. And then the last point that we did was the controller software itself. We obfuscated it, we encrypted the software so that the software couldn't be reverse engineered. It couldn't be installed onto a third-party manufacturing line, for example. It couldn't be tampered with, and you couldn't remove certain elements of functionality, checks, locks, so on and so forth. So the end result of this is the Tetra Pak brand is maintained. They can enforce that brand of that they've always worked towards, of making sure that they are well known for producing hygienic, high quality food packaging equipment, and every time people see the Tetra Pak brand, they know that whatever's going to be in there is going to be preserved, is going to be clean, and so on and so forth. And more importantly is that the FDA standards can be met, and they were since then able to start selling into the US. Thank you.
Great. So halfway through, that brings us to the third aspect of software monetization, tracking. A lot of talk about tracking this morning in Amy's presentation, right? So we're going to look at tracking as how effectively you're able to track and easily report on what end users are entitled to and what they have consumed, when, and to what extent. This is important for 3 reasons that I'm going to discuss. 1, business model enablement. 2, insight. 3, transparency. So let's just talk about each of those really quickly. So if we talk about business model enablement really quickly, what I mean by that is in Amy's presentation, Alan's presentation earlier, we talked about the need for usage-based business models. They sound really sexy. They sound really great on paper. I want to charge Alan every time he logs into my application. Or I want to charge Marcy every time she saves something. To be able to do things like that, you have to be able to track what's happening in your application. And where does that data come from? If you don't have a mechanism in place to track that usage and then easily report on it, feed it into other systems, you're not going to be able to support these business models. Now something more fun, insight or business intelligence, right? So there's really 3 types of business intelligence that I can bucket this stuff into. First is the optimization of roadmaps, right? So this is really a product management benefit for most organizations. If you as a product manager can track, okay, I know that 80% of users use these 3 features but never use the 4th one, you can de-invest in that feature. You could take it, either deprioritize it, take it off the roadmap altogether, but you can reinvest those funds somewhere where they'll be more productive or more useful. Support for sales and marketing. So if I'm in sales and marketing and I can go in and easily run a report of all users whose subscription is about to expire in the next 30 days. I can proactively shoot them a marketing email, have sales call them. I can proactively push renewals. I can push upgrades. If somebody's clicking on the reporting feature that's not activated yet, they're constantly trying to get access to it, I can report on that and I can send them a prompt to say, hey, I see you're trying to access reporting. Would you like to upgrade? And then finally, to improve your standard pricing and packaging. Similar to the product management benefits we had seen, if you are able to see what's most popular in your product, you can maybe strip out some of those most popular features and then put them in a slightly more premium or enterprise version. That way, hopefully, you see more folks coming in instead of at the basic version of your software, at a premium or enterprise version of your software, and you can make just a little bit more. And then thirdly, customer transparency. So this usage data is not just valuable to you. So as the software publisher, if you have this usage data, you also have the ability to decide how much of that data and to what extent you want to provide visibility to your end users. Right? Why would they want access to this information? Well, first, visibility into what they're actually using and how they're using it really helps them to build that understanding or an accurate view of the value they're getting from your application, which is something, surprisingly, a lot of software users don't understand today, especially with big network deployments. So there's 2 types of data, right? Real-time data can help them understand who's using it, how long they've been using it, how many licenses are still available, do I need to call my sales rep and get a couple more, am I still compliant? And then historical data can show them, all right, when's the software getting used most? Should I renegotiate the terms of my license agreement? How many licenses were refused? Do I have a whole bunch of people that are trying to access the application that don't get access? Should I increase the number of seats I have for my network license? And who are the power users? Do certain departments, certain people use the application more than others? Maybe I should go to them and ask them for some budget instead of it having come all out of IT. But all this information is useful to the end user and can do nothing but help build your relationship with them, depending on how much of visibility you want to give them to this information. So on that, I'm going to hand it off to Jam, who's going to talk about some examples of companies who have really used tracking to change the way they do business.
Thanks, Michelle. Yep. I kind of feel like I actually have an unfair advantage today because I get to talk about a section that I think is, or a use case at least, that I think is pretty darn cool. Now, the benefits of usage of tracking, I think, are pretty obvious, right? It's kind of like saying we should all make more money. We all want to know how our products are being used. We'd all like to track them better. Almost runs on cliches, right? So what I really wanted to talk about was an innovative way to actually transform your business with that sort of information. I think we'd all love to get more usage information. It's a big reason why cloud applications are so popular. You get a lot of built-in usage and tracking. But here's an example of something that it's been around for a few years, actually, really pioneering, really unique, and I think this company sort of led the charge in this, and thankfully they did it because otherwise I wouldn't have something as interesting to talk to you about. Talking about Aspen Tech. Start off with this idea that you have a way to gather usage information. So I'm making a few assumptions here, right? You've integrated technology. There are solutions out there that let you actually capture usage and licensing information. We can probably talk to you about a few of those. But let's make the assumption that you know how to capture this usage information. Beyond just getting the usual business intelligence and all that other good stuff, what can you actually do with it that can be transformational? Well, what Aspen did was they started to use that information to change how they actually offered their products to customers. The idea here is that you don't have to sit there and figure out which combination of suites or products you want to buy, what suite works for you. From an Aspen technology standpoint, you don't have to sit there and figure out what products make an effective bundle. Dave talked about, how do I package this? What are products that actually fit together? Well, in this model, you sort of get it all. And I'm oversimplifying a fairly complex and well thought out model here. But the idea here is that you don't necessarily buy software per se. What you do is you buy tokens. Think of it as going into a video arcade. I don't know if they even have them anymore. I'm dating myself a little here, but I think generally people here probably remember the arcades. If you went in there and you had to decide ahead of time which 3 video games you're going to have to play, it'd be a pretty poor experience. However, you go in there, you look at what's available, you buy tokens, and then you decide what you want to play and how often you want to play it. And that's sort of the concept here. Again, I'm simplifying a bit, but what you have access to is a suite of products, and you have tokens. The products, depending on their value, depending on what sort of purpose they serve, consume more tokens than others. As a customer, you use what you need. If you want to take your tokens and use them to another set of products, go ahead and apply those tokens there. You want to go ahead and apply it to a different product, take your tokens, apply them to a different product. You start to run out of tokens, buy more tokens. You don't have to sit there and scratch your head around, did I buy too much software? Did I buy too little software? How much am I using my software? Now, we always hear about perpetual and subscription, and as much as we like to, speak about subscription being sort of the way things are going, and everyone's taking shots at perpetual right now, there's certainly areas where both of those make sense. This changes things completely. It's neither perpetual, it's neither subscription. It's a combination of the two in its own unique way. In a sense, you're subscribing because you're really never overbuying. You only consume as much as you have. Over time, you are going to use up all your tokens. At some point, you're going to need to replenish your tokens. All you need to know is figure out, how many tokens do I regularly need to purchase. You're not stuck with too much software. It sort of took that whole complexity of, am I overbuying, overusing, overpaying, and turned it all around. It just eliminated that equation by focusing on just how much value you're buying. Now, what Aspen needs to figure out is, or what they did figure out is, how much they should, what value do I associate with each product, which is something that you'd be doing anyway. It just doesn't necessarily have to translate into the complexities of pricing, term, usage. That's sort of been abstracted from the customer, makes the entire customer buying process a lot easier. Now, it may not necessarily apply to all combinations of products, may not apply to all verticals, but certainly very good food for thought on a very unique way to offer products. I think I've probably spoken a little bit about this, but essentially what they did was they took this concept of licensing now and they married it to tokens. And what tends to happen is, we talk about these concepts of packaging, control, usage, management, and such, and we always still tend to think of it from a licensing paradigm. Us in the industry are guilty of it. Software vendors that have either built their own or used third-party technologies, everything is still sort of thought of from that basic licensing sort of paradigm. What am I licensing? What am I authorizing? What am I entitling? And I think what's interesting about this case is that's sort of not in play over here. What's really being used is you're using that core business intelligence to really just manage a business model. And that's where the tokens come into play, right? You don't have to worry about as strictly about enforcement or usage or what licenses are enabling what technology. You're really focusing on the customer experience, what they're consuming, and what they'll need to consume. And you can focus much more on the product development. You can start, selling vans and unicorns because, at the end of the day, the customer can hop out at any time they want. They're not even stuck on it till they go around the block in this model. So it's a really brilliant, unique way of looking at how you can just enable and monetize usage and tracking information into an actual business model. Now, what does this mean for the customer? This is where it gets even more exciting because from a customer standpoint, you have complete visibility into your usage. At any given time, you can go ahead and take a look at how many tokens you purchased and how many are left, but you can also map that exactly to which of my software consumes how many tokens. So at any given point, you can understand where you're using, applying your tokens, where you're getting the most value, what software is being used, and you never have to sit there and wonder whether you're overpaid or whether you're overusing, because those tokens are transferable, right? They apply across the board to any software. It's just the quantities of tokens that are being played around with here. So the customer experience is never one where there's a concern about overusage or, have I overbought my software? Because you're never really buying software. So from that standpoint, they've turned around a potentially negative customer experience. And probably for most people in the room, the one thing that causes some trepidation about whether I introduce licensing is what is my customer experience going to be? I've never been with a prospect or customer where at some point the customer experience doesn't drive the conversation. People are always concerned with how are people going to react either to the concept of licensing or, if my licensing isn't poorly or well thought out. I mean, Dave makes a living on helping people, plan this out well. But this turns that entire concept and actually not just levels it turns it into a positive customer experience because you really, it's a complete customer transparency into their usage, into their consumption, and looking actually historically into how much they should budget for future years because you're not really having to analyze how much software I've used. You can look at a quarter or a year or multiple years views of how many tokens you've consumed. So I think that was all I had from point of slideware, but wanted to introduce this idea. It's a little bit different. It's not your classic usage and tracking and business intelligence. I mean, all those buzzwords get thrown around. Those are fairly obvious. We all want those metrics. We all consume them differently. We all do different things with them. We either use industry analysis to do it or we use technology to get it for us. But there are ways where you can use this information to actually transform your business. And if you implement it the right way, different concepts can actually be used to enable your business in a pretty unique way. Thank you.
Okay, that brings us to the last aspect of software monetization, and one that's probably a favorite for a lot of people in the room, or not so favorite. Management, right? So any CFO or anybody in finance will tell you that revenue enablement is about more than, profitability is about more than revenue enablement. It's about cost control, right? Where can you reduce costs? Where can you streamline processes, right? So what we're going to talk about here today is improving our software monetization tools, how they function with the organization, is improving how we manage them, right? It's about process simplification and customer enablement. So for process simplification, what do I mean? So licensing touches so many aspects of an organization. I think once you start peeling the onions back, everyone's surprised about just how many people are impacted within an organization. Everyone from sales and marketing to engineering, product management, to customer services and tech support. All of these people need to go in, perform some tasks with regards to licensing and entitlement management, but they need access to that data, they need it quickly, and they need a centralized place to get it. Right? So the first aspect of business process simplification is centralization. It's providing a centralized point for all stakeholders within the organization to access the data and perform tasks. One step beyond centralization is understanding that different functions within the organization, heaven forbid, have other systems they use. So you need to integrate your licensing and entitlement management with those other systems. It could be things like a CRM, an ERP, a billing system, a marketing automation system. You have to make your licensing implementation work with the systems that already fuel your business today. Secondly, it's about automation. Once you've got the centralization figured out, you got that place where the data is living and you can pull it from, what can you automate, right? Automation's all about simplifying manual and therefore error-prone tasks, right? So tasks that could be automated once you have your licensing figured out are things like audit reporting, renewal reporting, product activation, upgrades, etc. These are two key aspects to helping simplify licensing within your organization. Then there's also customer enablement. Customer enablement is all about empowering end users to do tasks that currently bog down the various sales support functions within your organization. Right? They can be anything from enabling customers to activate their own entitlements, to manage them throughout the life cycle of their time with you, right? Let them renew on their own, let them rehost, let them revoke, let them run their own audit reports. All of these things should be able to be done without them having to interface with you. And if you can achieve that, you not only give them a greater customer satisfaction, but you can dramatically decrease the burden on your various customer service and tech support functions as well. So with that very simple overview, I'm going to hand it to Julie to kind of get in the weeds about how a few organizations have really gotten the management aspect right.
Thanks, Michelle. As Jam reminds me, I'm standing between you and lunch, so I'll try to make this brief. I also wanted to point out that as opposed to Dave, I came from the professional services world and then moved into the product management world. So I was involved prior to being at SafeNet in implementing licensing solutions and entitlement management solutions, typically for high-end customers. And then they brought me on board here because they knew I knew all the trials and tribulations related to that, and now they expect me to deliver the solutions, which I hope I've started to do. I want to talk to you today about a couple of examples of how business process simplification have been accomplished using centralization and also using automation. So I have 3 examples. One, this is really a common enterprise licensing infrastructure. A lot of companies, you'll see something along these lines. If they have multiple product lines or multiple products, they may have multiple licensing technologies. And typically, that results in multiple processes. Souter is one example of a company that we have. They are in Switzerland. They build energy management systems, and they actually have products that fall into 3 different platforms. So it's the same product line, but they have one Windows-based product. They have another that's a Linux-based product, and another that is embedded Linux. And they control them all in different ways. The Windows-based product was using dongles. The Linux-based product was a software licensing technology, and they had, or actually the other way around, the Linux was, they had no enforcement for the Linux, and they had a homegrown system for software licensing for their embedded solution. So what this means is they had multiple licensing technologies, some of which had different databases, and they had different processes for each of those, even though it's the same product line, and the customer experiences were different depending on which platform they were using. So what did they do? They implemented a centralized entitlement management solution that would marry all of those different products into one licensing delivery mechanism using EMS. The common back office, they actually retired one database system that was serving their Linux platform. They implemented the solution such that they were integrating with RMS, which was used to protect their Windows and their Linux-based solution. And they implemented their homegrown software technology licensing generator into the same system. So they had one common licensing back office to deliver licenses for both their homegrown and their commercial applications. One data flow, all of the data processing starting from their ERP, feeding EMS, feeding entitlements to EMS, and a common customer experience through the whole process. So in this particular case, they managed to consolidate the licensing delivery as well as the back office that contains the licensing information for business intelligence reasons. On the other end, let's talk about a large-scale consolidation. Ericsson actually already had a centralized solution for managing all their entitlements, but what they didn't have was a centralized way to deliver their license key technologies. They had over 20 different local companies, one for each country. Each of them had their own licensing delivery mechanism and their own licensing solution. Actually, the licensing technology that they used was the same in each of these local companies. However, because they were delivering unique licensing that had some aspects for each local company, they had a different system, a different actual Oracle-based system to deliver licenses for each local company. So a consolidated enterprise licensing entitlement management system, but had to call out to 20-plus different systems to get their licenses. What they did is they migrated all of those 20 licensing systems into a single back office delivery mechanism through EMS. So EMS has allowed them to generate all their licenses for all of their local companies through one single centralized system. And essentially, that means that they have reduced their, let me go back. It means they've actually been able to, or they will be able to eliminate over 20 production Oracle systems as a result of this. So you can see the financial benefits of removing over 20 production systems from being supported and maintained. Now let's talk about how automation has been used by some of our customers to simplify business processes. This case is Infoprint. Infoprint sells printing solutions. Infoprint has fully automated their licensing process. They Infoprint actually uses SafeNet as their hosting provider as well in this particular situation. So Infoprint has completely automated the whole process such that customers can come into a web store or order through their customer services. Customer service places the order. They use Oracle as their back-end system. Or orders placed in Oracle, it feeds into an centralized entitlement management system with EMS. An entitlement is generated, which automatically sends out a notification to the end customer, which contains an activation code. The end customer installs the software, enters the activation code. The software itself, using the API, the enforcement API, calls EMS to activate the software and return the key and have it automatically implemented in the system. So in this case, Infoprint has completely removed themselves from any manual processes whatsoever. They are not involved at all in the process of activating their software. And the savings from an operational standpoint there is quite significant. Even in those circumstances where the end product may not be, have access to the internet, they have leveraged self-service, as Michelle mentioned before, to allow customers to go to a web portal to actually activate the software, receive the key, and then sneaker net essentially over to the resulting system. So they've used both the fully automated process as well as manual process through the web portal. So those are just a couple of examples of how people have, how some of our customers have improved their business processes through automation and centralization.
So that covers the 4 aspects of software monetization, right? So I hope that through the presentation you not only got a better understanding or a comprehensive view of the whole scope of software monetization. I know frequently when I talk to people, they really get 1 or 2 of the aspects, but they haven't really taken the time to figure out, okay, what's the whole picture and what am I missing? Because you'll never get it all right, but if you have a list of a wish list almost and say, if I improve these things this year and this is on the radar, you'll just keep getting better, right? So it's your ability to package, control, track, and manage your application. And then I hope that the team here has been able to give you some good real implementation examples. I know I like examples. I explained something to me a million times, but if you give me a real example, it helps get my creative juices flowing. It helps me understand. So hopefully those were helpful also. And I think our advice to you guys, adoption of 1 of these techniques or 10 of them, the only outcome could really be more success than you have today. So more money, monetization.